There is my great Aunt Alice, who was married to I. Leonard Day, who knew Bob Jackson as a child in Spring Creek. It's a little game I invented called 6 Degrees from Robert H. Jackson. It's, even by my standards, that was pretty shameless the way I could work my family into the story here. Okay, if we could just take a minute to review, because I know I threw a lot of information out at you there. Immigrants, abolitionists, proud disciples of Abraham Lincoln, volunteers willing to sacrifice everything to preserve the Union, defeat the Confederate cause, and vanquish the Confederate flag. Good heavens, what kind of people were we? Don't tell a certain someone, it'll be our little secret. Now let's get to that transcendent, riveting, frustrating, indispensable undertaking known as the Nuremberg trials. The Nuremberg trials may have been bumpy and erratic, and a cesspool of intrigue and espionage, an early salvo in the Cold War, but it was also a sorely needed affirmation of human rights and the dignity of man. And at its heart was our hero, the chief American prosecutor, the boy from Warren and Chautauqua counties. This is pretty ghoulish stuff from here on in. So if we can all take a couple of deep breaths, we can get through it together here. I want you to imagine that it's November 21st, 1945, and that you're one of the scores of American newspaper, magazine, and radio correspondents assigned to cover the opening of the trial of Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg, Germany. Let me show you what Nuremberg is. This is post-war Germany, divided among the big four, the Soviet Union, the United States, England and France, and Nuremberg is right there, just on the edge of the flag in Bavaria. World War II, in November of 45, it ended 6 months earlier. Adolf Hitler and two of his leading henchmen, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the secret police, and Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, had committed suicide as Allied troops barreled into Germany. Now, finally, it was time to hold the surviving Nazi high command accountable for their many atrocities. Maybe you're Howard K. Smith, the future ABC television news anchorman, but then a radio reporter with CBS. Maybe you're the great William L. Shirer, like Smith, the CBS broadcaster. Shirer and Smith had been together in Berlin in the 1930s, covering Adolf Hitler's rise to power and eventual reign of terror. Smith, who slipped out of Germany just hours before Hitler declared war on the United States, wrote a book called Last Train from Berlin. Shirer went on to write the epic history of Nazi Germany, the rise and fall of the Third Reich. Maybe you're Janet Flanner of the New Yorker magazine, a splendid essayist who'd been assigned in Paris before the war broke out. Anybody recognize who Janet's friend is there? Yeah, it's Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was a correspondent during the war with Collier's magazine, and whenever he quoted two GIs, they sounded exactly like characters in A Farewell to Arms. Maybe you're Marguerite Higgins of the New York Herald Tribune, who had covered the Allied advance across Northern Europe and later won a Pulitzer Prize for her war correspondence in Korea. Maybe you're novelist and playwright John Dos Passos, hired to cover the trial by Life magazine. That's a scary amount like actor Paul Giamatti, doesn't he? Yeah. You could be the 29-year-old Walter Cronkite of United Press, and I want you to remember something. Take a look at that empty chair. Looks pretty plush, doesn't it? We'll get to that in a second.
Just 1 second. You're saying we can hear you better if you move the microphone away?
It's very mumbled when you go through the mic.
Is this better?
You hear you more clearly.
Is this better? Okay, just move away. Okay. You could also be the 26-year-old Andy Rooney. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. And look at how young Rooney is there. A veteran of Stars and Stripes, then stringing for Holiday magazine. Both eventually covered Nuremberg, but neither was there on November 21st of 45. Cronkite, in fact, would be further delayed in covering the trial when UP diverted him to report on the funeral proceedings for General George S. Pett, who was killed that December in an automobile accident in Mannheim, Germany. As a reporter, you've probably been writing stories from Nuremberg for at least a week or two, and you've been spending way too much time in the Marble Room, the bar of the Grand Hotel, and a couple of other Nuremberg speakeasies. Despite acute shortages of food in post-war Germany, there appear to be endless supplies of wine, beer, and liquor. The male reporters are holed up at Stein Castle, an ancient fortress. It all sounds very glamorous until you find out you're sleeping on an army cot with about 4 dozen other guys, and you've got very restricted restroom privileges. Most guys don't even bother to shave through the course of the trials. After you file your articles, you wander the bombed-out city, stunned by the decimation you see everywhere. Nurembergers are living upside down, squatting in basements, barely eking out an existence. It's the price Nuremberg paid for its factories that produced panzer tanks and train locomotives, the military targets that lured thousands of Allied bombers, and in the war's final stages, 3rd Division infantrymen who fought a bloody 5-day street battle for control of the city. One of the few buildings outside the Grand Hotel, the Stein Castle, that escaped severe damage is the Palace of Justice, where nearly 1,000 Allied soldiers and workers have spent months feverishly getting the courtroom ready. Before the war, Nuremberg had been a picturesque city of 450,000 people, a Bavarian enclave of gingerbread houses, prim shops, and Gothic churches. Nuremberg loomed large in Adolf Hitler's twisted mind. He thought its storybook appeal embodied the Teutonic ideal. Hence, in the 1930s, Nuremberg became the testing ground for Hitler's demonic theories of Aryan supremacy. Nuremberg is where Hitler held his week-long Sieg Heil rallies, sick orgies culminating in the burning of thousands of books. Hitler insisted that Nuremberg Stadium be the venue for the chilling Nazi documentary Triumph of the Will. And it's why Hitler chose to call his efforts to persecute Jews and deny them freedom and personal property the Nuremberg Laws. It's because of Nuremberg's central role in Nazi culture and propaganda that the chief American prosecutor chose the city as the venue for the war crimes trial. He wanted Nazi leaders tried and convicted in the place that gave rise to their pathological delusions. And he wanted the trials to be conducted in the Palace of Justice. Less than a year before, it had housed the local headquarters of the Gestapo, Hitler's murderous secret police. The chief prosecutor said he wanted the war crimes trials to project an aura of melancholy grandeur. Whether you're Howard K. Smith or Marguerite Higgins or whomever, you're plenty melancholy, and you certainly don't sense much grandeur. Indeed, you've got serious misgivings about these trials. After all, an attempt to prosecute German officials for war crimes after the First World War had proven farcical. Now, in the aftermath of the Second World War, the winning side was again struggling with how to mete out appropriate justice. Just a few weeks earlier, the country of Bulgaria had exhibited mind-numbing efficiency when it tried its one-time Nazi occupiers. The Bulgarian prosecutors presented their case in the morning. The judge rendered his guilty verdicts that afternoon, and the firing squads and burials were carried out that same evening. As we reporters ordered another round of cocktails, most likely from an American or Russian operative disguised as a bartender or waitress, since Nuremberg was rife with spies of both sexes. Debates rage about the trial's utility and value. Maybe the Bulgarians had it right. Was affording Nazi leaders due process and equal protection under the law really the best way to expose and punish their wickedness? Did it make sense to give a fair trial to the thugs behind the the genocide of 6 million European Jews and a global conflagration that claimed 60 million lives, 2/3 of them non-combatants. And what about these murky conspiracy charges and this unprecedented emphasis on crimes against humanity and crimes against peace that the prosecution said it wanted to pursue? Weren't such conspiracy charges awfully hard to prove? Couldn't the whole process be viewed as an exercise in ex post facto law? In other words, the Allies were essentially imposing a legal and moral code on their vanquished enemy that did not exist before hostilities started. Until very late in the war, no less an authority than British Prime Minister Winston Churchill believed that once captured, the best way to deal with Nazi domos was to take them out and shoot them. And what about having the Soviet Union sit in judgment? Hadn't Stalinist Russia perpetrated some of the same crimes for which the Nazis were now being prosecuted? What of the other two members of the Big Four Allied Tribunal? Great Britain and France. As colonial powers, they had for 3 centuries denied human rights to millions of their subjects around the world. An inconvenient fact that Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels had beaten like a drum during the war. And what of the United States of America in 1945? Yes, we had helped win a cataclysmic war against racial hatred, but we'd done it with a military that was as racially segregated as an Alabama lunchroom at the time. That autumn, moreover, more than 110,000 Americans of Japanese descent were returning to their homes on the West Coast after being forced to spend the duration in internment camps following the attack on Pearl Harbor. It wasn't exactly material for a new verse of the Star-Spangled Banner. To be sure, the depravity of Nazi Germany was way beyond anything that had transpired in previous wars, or previous civilizations for that matter. It was so massive, so hideous, that it cried out for concerted punishment. But how? Great Britain and France had judicial systems far different from those of the United States, and miles removed from the Soviet Union's. How were all these conflicting factors supposed to come together to prosecute, convict, and punish some of history's most despicable criminals? Initially, there were 24 high-ranking Nazis that the Allies determined were the worst of the worst. They were to be tried first at Nuremberg, with many other lesser Nazis to follow. One of the original 24 committed suicide, one fell ill, and one was tried in absentia. So there were 21 defendants standing trial in the fall of 1945. Among them were Hermann Goering, Hitler's right-hand man who engineered the seizing of Jewish property, and as head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had been responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians in bombing raids throughout Europe. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister and the Nazi leader whose treachery led to the annihilation of millions of Eastern European and Russian Jews. Rudolf Hess had run the training academies for the Gestapo and the SS. Hess became notorious in mid-war as the Nazi leader who, without Hitler's knowledge, flew a small plane to the United Kingdom in an apparently deranged effort to broker a peace with Churchill. Churchill concluded that Hess was nuts, threw him in jail, and kept him there until the end of the war. Albert Speer, the gentleman Nazi, the one with impeccable manners and flawless English, Hitler's favorite architect and the genius behind the Nuremberg rallies. Speer employed hundreds of thousands of slave laborers, many of whom died of exposure or malnutrition. It was all ghastly, all infamous. But around the Marble Room bar, we reporters keep asking ourselves, how can infamy be prosecuted? Since we're reporters, some of us know the chief American prosecutor from our time covering politics. After all, he'd been Attorney General, then a member of the Supreme Court, before accepting President Truman's appointment and taking a leave of absence from the court to head the U.S. prosecution team. Some of us know that he had argued 28 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won 27 of them. Some of us know that FDR had so much respect and affection for him that he had been on the short list of potential Democratic presidential candidates if FDR chose not to seek a third term in 1940. And almost all of us know, unlike Roosevelt, that he'd come up from the bootstraps and that as a young lawyer in Western New York had spent time as a prosecutor. Many of us had admired the legal rationale that as Attorney General, he had crafted to justify Lend-Lease, the Roosevelt administration's controversial program to provide Britain with American warships, aircraft, and other emergency munitions at a time when England faced Nazi Germany virtually alone. Reconciling Lend-Lease to existing statutes took some resourceful lawyering. Lend-Lease was, without doubt, a violation of the Neutrality Act and other U.S. laws discouraging foreign entanglements. But some of us had been in Northern Europe during the Hitler's Blitzkrieg in the spring of '40 and in London during the Nazis' bombing blitz that fall. We had seen up close the devastating effect of Adolf Hitler's devotion to total war. We're grateful that FDR and his Attorney General had maneuvered Lend-Lease through a wary Congress. We're also impressed by the leadership this gentleman had shown at the Big Four's London Conference earlier in 1945. He had helped define the charges that would undergird the war crimes trials, created the first international criminal court, and established the foundations of the international law that we all subscribe to today. As champions of the First Amendment, furthermore, many of us had admired the majority opinion this gentleman had authored in 1943 in a freedom of expression case that reached the Supreme Court. The issue before the court 2 years earlier had been simple but profound. Could a West Virginia school district, or any school district, force students to recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag? The students happened to be Jehovah's Witnesses. Their beliefs forbade them from saluting any political institution or symbol. It was the middle of a world war. Patriotism was running at a fever pitch. What would be the big deal if kids from a small religious sect were made to stand up and say the pledge with their classmates? But in words that are among the most celebrated in the annals of American constitutional law, the justice, who was now the chief American prosecutor at Nuremberg, had written, "The very purpose of the Bill of Rights was to withdraw certain subjects from the vicissitudes of political controversy, to place them beyond the reach of majorities and officials, and establish them as legal principles to be applied by courts. One's right to life, liberty, and property, to free speech and free press, freedom of worship and assembly, and other fundamental rights may not be submitted to a vote. They depend on the outcome of no election." Every 8th grader in America should be made to memorize that. It was a stirring testament to America's tradition of religious freedom and tolerance. So, many of us correspondents admire this prosecutor, but we're still skeptical about the process he's directed. Yesterday, November 20th, had been the first day of the trial and was mainly taken up by preliminary administrative matters. The real trial, the beginning of the presentation of the prosecution's case against the defendants, will start today. As members of the Fourth Estate, we're all situated inside the Palace of Justice's newly renovated courtroom. We're sitting in plush seats that had been borrowed from a bombed-out local theater. Okay, so the press is over here. This is where the judges sat. Okay, that was the lectern that the lawyers addressed the court. Here are the Nazi defendants, the guards behind them, their counsel, and the table in front. This is from the opposite point of view. It gives you a slightly better look. And here you can see Goering there, slumped over. There's Hess next to him. That's von Ribbentrop. I know it's hard to tell given the darkness of the photograph, but that's von Ribbentrop in his full Wehrmacht uniform. And Speer is, I think, right there. From our vantage point, we notice that the chief U.S. prosecutor is somberly turned out. He's wearing a morning coat with tails, striped trousers, a starched collar from a bygone era, a muted dark tie, and wire-rimmed glasses. Melancholy grandeur indeed. We observe that he is broad-shouldered and square-jawed, and equipped with a grovelly baritone that he employs to great effect. We know from his Supreme Court opinions that he prides himself on writing crisp, evocative English, peppered with literary references, and in taking arcane legal arguments and boiling them down to simple concepts. All eyes in the courtroom watch as he slowly takes his place at the lectern. He plans to speak at a deliberate clip so that the battery of interpreters, translating from English to German, English to Russian, and English to French, can keep up. The translators are working through a new headphone system pioneered by an American company called IBM. He clears his throat and looks up at the chief judge to be recognized. We reporters listen intently, mesmerized by the oratory of Robert Howard Jackson. For more than 2 hours that morning and 2 more hours that afternoon, Jackson spells out in powerful language the case against Nazi Germany and its campaign of terror and genocide. "You will say I have robbed you of your sleep," he says after describing the Nazis' butchery in Warsaw, "but these are things which have turned the stomach of the world." As the day wore on, John Dos Passos was to write in Life magazine, and Jackson reasonably, dispassionately, with magnificent clarity, unfolds the case against them, taking the evidence out of their own mouths, out of their written orders. A change comes over the Nazi prisoners' box. They stir uncomfortably in their seats. They give strange starts and shudders when they hear their own words, their own secret diaries quoted against them. When the prosecutor reaches the crimes against the Jews, they freeze into an agony of attention. The voice of the German translator follows the prosecutor's voice like a shrill echo of vengeance. Once Jackson finished that morning, the lead judge, Englishman Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, gavels a break in the proceedings. Writes Dos Passos, "I doubt if there is a man or woman in the courtroom who does not feel that great and courageous words were spoken. We Americans rise to our feet with a feeling of pride because it was a countryman of ours who spoke them." We reporters forget all about detachment and objectivity and mob Jackson as he leaves the courtroom. Howard K. Smith grabs Jackson's hand and says he finally understands the mentality that had murdered so many of his friends in Germany. William L. Shirer tells Jackson that the speech gave him chills and that he's never been so proud to be an American. Jackson's speech dominates the front page of newspapers and is the top story on radio broadcasts all over the world. British editorialists are quick to compare Jackson's performance to such great English orators as Benjamin Disraeli and William Gladstone. But as Americans, we recognize the lilt and cadence of Jackson's words. It comes from a speech delivered in his native Commonwealth just 29 years before he was born, a speech whose words and rhythm he had as a child committed to heart and memory. From these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, Abraham Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. If only the trial had ended at that moment, with Jackson's Lincoln-inspired prose still ringing in everyone's ears, the Nazis' wretched pathology exposed, the world applauding, and the moral clarity of the trial unquestioned. Alas, the Nuremberg trials did not work out that way. Not unlike other high-profile trials in history, think the Scopes monkey trial. Did you see Clarence Darrow? And the trial of Bruno Hauptmann, the Lindbergh baby killer. Nuremberg got caught up in peripheral issues, jockeying between the prosecution and the judges, internal bickering among members of the prosecution team, grandstanding from the accused, obstructionism from the defense lawyers, and the worst kind of armchair quarterbacking rendered by the worst kind of armchair quarterbacks, we, the press. And there was a source of tension present at Nuremberg that morning, at Nuremberg that was missing in other big trials. The utter lack of trust between two presiding superpowers. You could walk down a Nuremberg street without bumping, you could not walk down a Nuremberg street without bumping into an American or Soviet agent, or French or British operatives for that matter. One Russian female agent used her wily ways to compromise a senior member of Jackson's staff. Throughout the trials, there was great fear that the Soviets would walk out and condemn the proceedings. Yet, incredibly, Soviet deceit and superpower headbutting was not Jackson's biggest headache. Rather, it was his dealings with the Judicial Tribunal. The relationship between Jackson and the American judge, his old nemesis Francis Biddle, had always been testy. One was mainline, the other Main Street. But as the trial wore on, it degenerated into something downright nasty. At almost every turn, Biddle sided with the British, French, and Soviet judges in imposing rules that made the prosecution's job tougher. When the trial began, there was great optimism from Jackson's team that it could be completed inside a couple of months. But much like the war itself, it dragged on and on. At times, it threatened to go off the rails. One morning, a rumor swept through the courtroom that a posse of one-time SS officers had escaped from a prisoner of war camp outside Nuremberg and was headed to the Palace of Justice, armed, dangerous, and with murderous vengeance in mind. The story turned out to be unfounded, of course, but that didn't stop the U.S. Army from surrounding the Palace of Justice with tanks and troops. Why did it get so convoluted? Why did it take the better part of a year to finish? It would take us a week to review all the factors, but it can be boiled down to these four things. First was the tribunal's decision to adopt rules giving the defendants the widest possible latitude to defend themselves. There were strong political reasons for the judges' decision-making. They not only wanted the world to see that the trials were being conducted in an open and forthright way, they also wanted to acquit certain defendants if the evidence did not add up, and to hand down sentences less severe than execution by hanging. Second, Jackson insisted in building on the same strategy that Dos Passos hailed in his opening statement. using the Nazis' own words and documents to convict them. Instead of high-voltage witnesses and damning film and audio, and there was no shortage of all three, Jackson chose to rely mainly on the Germans' own orders. Descriptions of plundered or ransacked property, status reports on slave labor projects, assessments of death camps, and other nightmarish things, all spelled out on paper with ruthless Germanic efficiency. The fact that the Germans had not destroyed these documents as the Allies tore through the fatherland in the winter and spring of 1945 stunned Jackson and the Allied prosecution team. They became perhaps too infatuated with them. In black and white, Jackson wanted to show that the Nazis had not only committed these detestable crimes, but had colluded for many months, in certain cases many years, to carry them out. He wanted to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that heinous criminality was at the core of the Third Reich and had been from the first moments of Hitler's grubby ascent to power. At least at the outset, Jackson's methodical approach worked, but it lacked fireworks. After a while, pieces of paper that authorized mass enslavement or the killing of unarmed civilians lose their shock value. The trial soon slipped to second-tier news. In the wind-up to the trials, General William Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the U.S. Army's Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, had been Jackson's greatest ally and a key provider of evidence against the Nazis. But Donovan grew frustrated with Jackson's paper trail strategy, scolding him for ignoring the trial's public relations dimension. Jackson and Donovan had a falling out. The intelligence chief soon returned to Washington. Donovan was no doubt correct that Jackson tried to take on too much. Besides leading the prosecution, Jackson had to manage a huge and unwieldy staff beset by infighting, play host and diplomat with officials from the other three countries, assess espionage reports, keep the Soviets at a distance but still somehow on board, try to broker a decent working relationship with members of the tribunal, shape media coverage, and when the trial hit inevitable bumps, serve as its crisis manager. It would have overwhelmed anyone. There's no doubt it took years off of Jackson's life. It was not Jackson's doing that the defendants and their counsel had been given so much leeway by the tribunal. Nor was it Jackson's doing that Hermann Goering proved so glib and slippery on the stand. Early in the proceedings, Jackson had quipped that Goering's pudgy fingers had been in every Nazi pie, and they had been, from the burning of the Reichstag to the abject terror of Kristallnacht to the ravages of the Luftwaffe. Goering knew he was going to be sentenced to hang. He also knew that he would never climb the gallows. He had a cyanide pill hidden away that he was planning to swallow on the eve of his execution. Walter Cronkite and other reporters believe that Goering manipulated his extensive time in the witness chair to lay out a roadmap for future Nazis. Here's where we went right, and here's where we went wrong, Goering seemed to be saying. Don't repeat our mistakes. Third, it had been a long time since Robert Jackson had subjected a witness to hostile questioning. The Nazis were essentially street thugs. They demanded a street thug prosecutor. Jackson may have been too classic, too academic, to be an effective interrogator of these awful people. One of his chief deputies, Thomas Dodd, who at one time had been an FBI agent who had staked out John Dillinger, and a district attorney who had locked up hundreds of hoodlums. At least in Cronkite's estimation, Dodd's rat-a-tat prosecutorial style was better suited to make the Nazis squirm than Jackson's more refined approach. No one had admired Jackson more than his old friend, Franklin Roosevelt. Yet FDR worried that Jackson lacked the appetite for political combat, which may have been a wonderful personal tribute to Jackson, but might suggest why his questioning of witnesses at Nuremberg sometimes left something to be desired. Goering wasn't the only defendant who proved slick and lucid. Rudolf Hess's courtroom demeanor was erratic. Lucid one moment, incoherent the next. Was his bizarre behavior real or feigned? Most judges concluded it was real enough, which might explain why Hess avoided the hangman. Albert Speer knew exactly who his audience was. British Chief Judge Geoffrey Lawrence and American lead judge Francis Biddle, and played to them. Speer presented himself as a man of distinction, who was at best a reluctant warrior for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi cause. Slave labor, death camps. Speer claimed to have no prior knowledge. Lawrence was the product of a British caste system that bore an uncomfortably close resemblance to the rigidity of German society. And Biddle, as we've learned, was an American aristocrat. Playing the class card helped Speer get off with a 20-year sentence. Finally, and most importantly, Nuremberg's difficulties are what happen in a free society. Democracy is not only inefficient, it's often chaotic, and so are the trials held in democratic society. As Churchill was fond of saying, democracy is the worst form of government known to man, except for all the others. In Hitler's nightmarish dictatorship, an independent judiciary was a cruel joke. Nuremberg was, with little doubt, the zenith of Robert Jackson's public life. It was also, with little doubt, the part of his career that elicits the most pointed criticism. Yet, for all the recriminations surrounding the way the trials were conducted, 19 of the 21 defendants were convicted. 12, including Goering and von Ribbentrop, were sentenced to hang. Despite being watched like a hawk, Goering managed to ingest the cyanide tablet without being detected. He was found dead in his jail cell just hours before the hangings were to be carried out. Even in death, Goering dominated the proceedings, which of course is what he had set out to do. This is how moviegoers in the fall of 1946 heard about the Nuremberg convictions via newsreel.
And the Hall of Justice in Nuremberg, history's greatest trial, nears its fateful close. Under the most elaborate security precautions, only official cars pass the heavily guarded street barricade. Flags of the victorious Allies, sitting in judgment on the International Military Tribunal, fly over the court building.
Wish we still had newsreels. I love that stuff. A few weeks earlier, in his closing statement at the trials, Jackson had been able to regain the trial's moral footing. Of one thing we may be sure, Jackson averred, the future will never have to ask with misgiving, what could the Nazis have said in their favor? History will know that whatever could be said, they were allowed to say. They have been given the trial, the kind of a trial which they, in the days of their pomp and power, never gave to any man. Of one thing we may be sure. Robert Jackson's gift to all of us remains luminous. 82 years separated Abraham Lincoln's proclamation of a new birth of freedom from Robert Jackson's affirmation that civilized nations, led by the United States, would never allow that freedom to disappear, or to let scoundrels get away with trampling those freedoms and murdering innocents by the millions. Therein lies Robert Jackson's genius in Nuremberg. It was Gettysburg magnified 1,000 times over, wasn't it? In the wake of a global apocalypse of unimaginable horror, it fell on an American farm kid without a college education to help restore civilized order and the rule of law. Adhering to American values is hard, Jackson reminded us in Nuremberg. Equality, fairness, justice. The universal principles that the Jackson Center does such a superb job of celebrating are hard things to live up to. Maybe it's easier to force young Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag. Maybe it's easier to take Nazi thugs out into an alleyway and shoot them. But when we give into those dark impulses, we not only desecrate Lincoln and Jackson, we demean ourselves. We take the easy path, not the hard one. Nuremberg's hardness took much out of Robert Jackson. He struggled with health issues the last 8 years of his life and died much too young. But not before he joined the unanimous Supreme Court that at long last ended racial segregation in America's schools. It was a fitting capstone, a chance 9 decades later to carry out Lincoln's admonition to rediscover the better angels of our nature. Soon enough, we will be as far removed from Nuremberg as Robert Jackson's opening statement was from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It's up to us to work with the good people at the Jackson Center and other groups to ensure that their magnificent legacies never die. The United States of America remains today what it was 155 years ago, when our bucktails were marching below these windows. And 71 years ago, when our 3rd Division liberated Nuremberg from the scourge of fascism. A country, as Robert Jackson put it, that can never afford to take liberties with liberty itself. In Abraham Lincoln's exquisite phrase, mankind's last best hope. Thank you.